So it's hour 2 of lesson 11. We've set up and written our first unit test. So we want to write a second test for this method now. So I'll use the test method decorator. So Visual Studio knows, hey, this is a unit test. And to run it, when we try and run our tests. So we'll call this, our test will be public. Again, it returns void. So we'll call it index loads index view. So we want to make sure that when we call the index method, we get back a view, and that view should also be named index. So we'll set up our test again with our arrange, our act, and our assert. Our arrange statement's going to be exactly the same. We'll just create our controller. Our act is going to be similar, but not exactly. We're going to need to modify it a little. We're still going to need to call controller index. We're testing the index method. The issue here is our method returns an iAction result. So an iAction result's kind of like a general class. So it's not explicitly saying we're returning a view. So we must cast the return value, return type, from iAction result, which is generic, to a view result, which is specific. So around this, in front of this, I'm going to put in brackets view result. And Visual Studio complains. It says, what is a view result? Well, we're just missing a reference. So I'll just accept my reference to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC. Remember, we're in a totally separate project, and this isn't a web project, so it doesn't really know what MVC is without this reference. So we'll add it. So now we want to assert .r equal, and we provide two things here. Diana, that's a good question. We are going to. We're just keeping it simple right now in the dummies controller. Yes, in our products controller, we can set up the controller once, and then we can use that same controller in all the unit tests. So it's a great question, and we're absolutely going to do that. So the R equal method takes two parameters. What are we expecting, and what did we get? So we are expecting a view called index, right? And what we got back is our result, and we want to check the result.view name. So when we call the index method of our dummies controller, we should get back a view, and that view should be called index. So I'll save this. I'm going to try out this in the browser for a minute and make sure we get. So I'll go to my localhost /dummies, which would call the index method. And then I'll try the unit test in just a second. I want to make sure our new dummies view, that says this is the dummies index page. So this loads in my browser. So the controller seems to work, and it's loading a view that we just created here. So that seems to work. So let's try the unit test now. Create an instance of the controller, call the index method, get a view result back, and then make sure that the view name of that result is called index. So I will run my test. So I can click on test and run all tests. Maybe even I'll dock in my window here. And, test failed. Right? We see it here in Test Explorer. We also get an X here. So why did the test fail? If I click on it in Test Explorer, it tells me we expected index, but the name of our view was actually null. So that seems kind of weird. Why would the name of the view be null? It works in the browser. We can call the index method and it loads the index view. We get the proper result here. So this is an example where something's working in the browser, but yet our unit test is failing. So this suggests there is something we should do in the index method. It does return a view, but our Test Explorer says the name of that view is empty. I can even run it with a breakpoint here. Justin, you mentioned using a breakpoint earlier. So if I put a breakpoint here, I could right-click and try to debug my test. You don't have to do this, but this will just help us evaluate what's happening here. So my result initializes to null, and if I press the F11 key, it calls the index method, which returns a view. So now if I look at my result, can mouse over and expand my little window. So I have a view, yet the name is empty. Doesn't actually tell me the name of the view, which is why our test is failing. So what could we do here in our controller method to be more explicit? This says return a view, but it's not actually telling us which view is being returned. So we want to make a change here so that we're being very intentional about which view should be loaded by this method. How could we modify line 18 here to be more intentional about which view should load? Give you a hint. If I just type over, it says there's 4 different versions of this return view method. The first one is like this. It just creates a view. The second version, which we've used before, this is when we're providing data to a view, which we're not doing in this case. The third version of our return view statement, what is it suggesting we can provide here inside the brackets? Yeah, we can explicitly provide the name of the view we're loading. So what is the name of the view we're loading as a string? What view is being called? The dummies is the controller. What's the name of the actual view? Right. So if we put this in as a string, this is where our unit test helps us write better code in the controller. Yes, our page is working in the browser, but it also doesn't specify which view is supposed to load. So if I save this, I could even rerun my unit test from here. So 1 of 2 passing. If I click this, I could run them right from here. And now this should fix our unit test. Our unit test is expecting, so now they both pass. Our test is expecting a result, of type view result with the name index. And our method very explicitly returns the name called index. So this is one of the things you'll need to do in your assignment, is wherever your controller method, whatever method you're testing, if it's returning a view, like here our index method, we're going to want to specify the name of the view and be very explicit that this returns the index view and some data. This returns the details view and some data. This returns the create view, etc. Okay, so we can go back now to our product controller test. Now that we've written a couple of simple tests using the dummy controller. And then we're also going to look at Diana's suggestion, like we've repeated the same code here in the arrange statement. So if we have a whole bunch of tests, this gets tedious to arrange the same thing. Couldn't we kind of preload the arranging and just create this controller once and share it? And the answer is yes, we're going to do that. So let's try and create a similar test here for the products controller. So our arrange is going to be var controller equals new products controller. Not the products controller test, but new products controller. We've got an error, so we need to reference our controllers in our web project. Yet we still have an error. Sort of odd, right? When we go back and look here, this seemed to work. Controller equals new dummies controller. Yet here we've got an error that we can't quite so easily fix. There's no argument given. So what's missing here? Right. Diana, you've got it. If we go and look at our products controller up at the very top, here's our constructor. We talked about dependency injection last week. In our cart controller, we can't create the products controller if we don't pass in a database connection object, as Diana's saying. So this creates a bit of a problem when we're unit testing. Because when we're unit testing, we want to test within our program only. The database is not technically part of our web project. It's a separate application, right, that we're connecting to. So if we're testing with our database, we're really no longer doing unit testing. That's a different kind of testing and it's valid, but that's called integration testing, when we're testing our main program with another application, whether it's our database or our Google or Microsoft login or the Stripe gateway. Testing all of those systems is integration. How does our application work with those other external systems? So this creates a challenge if we want to unit test the products controller, because right now the products controller is set up that it has to be connected to a database in order for any of this stuff to work. So we need some way. Well, what we want to do is we want a way to test the code in the products controller, but without being connected to SQL Server. So Microsoft has a solution for this that we're going to use. What we're going to use, and I put a link up here so you can read more about it. Actually, sorry, I'm not going to show you the video. What's that? But Microsoft has a library that creates an in-memory database. It's kind of like local storage. So what we do when we want to unit test our controller is we can make an in-memory database. So it's kind of like a mock database. We can put a few product in it, just in memory, and then we can unit test with the in-memory database. So that way we can supply a database to the controller, but the database just lives within Visual Studio temporarily, and we're not actually using our SQL Server database at all. So it's a way of temporarily saying to SQL Server, you just sit over there. We're going to use this other database instead while we unit test. And once we're sure the code is right, then we can use SQL Server and do integration testing. So in our product controller test, we want to set up an in-memory database and put a few products into it that we're just going to kind of mock up. And then we can pass an instance of that to our controller. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our project configured for this. So these will be global, these will be class level variables used for all unit tests. So we're moving some of the arranging outside of the individual tests into the class, which I think, Diana, is what you were suggesting. So the first thing we're going to do is set up an application DB context called context. And again, Visual Studio doesn't know what this is. Now we don't want to link, we don't want to accept this reference. We don't want to use the database that's in our web project. Yeah, we wouldn't be doing unit tests to check if the DB is enabled. That would be a totally different kind of testing. We'd be doing integration testing. So that's beyond the scope of our lesson for today. Yes. I'm going to leave this error here for now, just a minute. We're also going to create a list of type product called products. So we're going to create a new list of products. So this will be our mock in-memory database. This will be our mock list of products. Controller object used for all unit tests. Sorry, products controller. We'll just call it controller. So we need all of these variables. On line 14, we can just make a reference to our models folder. So we'll say using our getmeagame.models. And we also need system.collections.generic in order to use the list class. So I've added those two references, and those errors go away on line 14. I realize we have an error here. We'll deal with this in a minute. So now we're going to set up a special method in here. And we're going to add above it this decorator, test initialize. So Diane, I think we're coming to the part that you were suggesting earlier. Public void test. So what do you suppose the test initialize method might do based on the name? What might the purpose be? what could test initialize be used for? Good guess, Farouk. Similar. Test initialize. This is setup code that runs automatically before every unit test. I guess I should call it, this is arrange code. So anything we want in all of our tests, we can put it in test initialize. So creating the controller and populating our mock data, we can move it in here, because then it will run automatically when it has this test initialize decorator. It's not its own test, it's like startup code that's fired before every single unit test. So here's where we want to create new in-memory DB. So we're going to create a new DB context, options builder. And we're going to use our in-memory database. And we just give it a name, in-memory DB. So this gives me an error as well. So we need to now reference Entity Framework Core. So we still have a couple errors here because we're missing, we need to install a Nuget package. Doesn't know what this use in-memory database is. We could have done this first. So there's a command on Blackboard. I'll put it in the shell. What we want is we want to install Entity Framework Core's in-memory database. So if you copy that from Blackboard, I'll put it in the chat. We can use the Nuget, we can use Nuget Package Manager to install the library that we need. So you can use the Package Manager console, or faster, click on Tools, Nuget Package Manager, and choose Manage Nuget Packages for Solution. This is going to open a little graphical interface where we can add packages. Click this. Click on the Browse tab up on the top left. And then you can just paste in Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.InMemory. So I'm going to click on that, but I've got to make one change here. You'll notice the version here is version 5. This is for Entity Framework Core 5 and higher. We're not using 5 yet. So it also says, it shows us both our projects. It says, do you want to install this in both projects? We only need it in the unit testing project. We're not going to use this in the web application. So again, just paste it in under Browse. Check, get me a game tests. And I'm going to choose version 3.1.10. I can't leave this at version 5. Version 5 is too new for our application because we're using .NET Core 3.1. And then I'm going to click Install. It'll ask me to accept the license, which I will. And it will grab the library. It's okay, I've still got a few errors here, that's all right. Bear with me for 1 second. I want to make sure. Okay. So now I'll just accept the other reference to use the get me a game data. So we're creating a database object, but we're not using SQL Server. We're using an in-memory database instead. So then we'll have our context equals new with our options. So this creates a new database, but it's an in-memory database only. We're not connecting to SQL Server. I'm going to take out this line on line 40. We don't need it anymore. This code is now going to happen up here in test initialize. So now we want to create mock data and add to in-memory DB. I'll put all this up on paste bin in a minute. Yes, use the date, make the reference to data. So we're referencing the controllers, data, and the models. We've also added manually references to Entity Framework Core. We've basically added all these references through the code hinting. There's our full list. So I'm going to create a category. ID equals, I don't know, 300. Name equals some category. I'm then going to create 3 products in our in-memory database. Excuse me. The products. So this is the list we've created up here. We've got this empty list of products. I'm going to call products.add a new product. I'll put in some IDs. I'll just make them up. Whoops, equals category. So I'll make 3 new products. So now I'll save them to the mock database. So, actually, we'll do it this way. Sorry, before I do this, I should call context.categories.add. So this will actually add our new category to the mock database. We're going to do the same with the products. So we have one more line here. I will put this all on Pastebin in a minute. So all of this code we're doing was because of what Diana mentioned earlier. We have to do all of this before we can create our controller, because our controller needs an application DB context, and we want to have some product and category data inside it. Now create the controller and pass it the DB context. So now we can call new products controller, and we've got a database connection that has some data in it that we can work with. So there's a fair bit of setup here. And by putting it all in the initialize method, we have this database in memory for all of our unit tests. So I'll put this entire file up on Pastebin as it is right now. Here's the link in the chat. Recording. So we've declared a database connection, declared a list of products, declared a controller. Before every test, we're creating a new database in memory, creating our new database. Sorry, we're setting it up and creating it as an in-memory database. May need to change one thing here, but we'll see. This is our DB set. When you just mouse over it, right? This is declared in our application DB context. So if we open it up under data, it's right here. Way back from when we created the category and product models, like in lesson 3 or 4. We did. We had one category, but because we have 3 products, I created the 3 products in memory, and then I added them to the database in this loop. So we called add, and then we committed those changes to the database. So then finally, we now have this context object. It's a database. It's got 1 category and 3 products, and we could pass it to the controller. So now in here, we can say, so I'm going to rewrite this test a little bit. Arrange is now done in test initialize. So now we want to call the index method and make sure we get back a result that's not null. So var result equals controller.index. So we want to assert that our result is not null. So there's our test. So our setup is complicated. Our unit test is simple. So if I want to run my test, I can go to my test explorer, run all my tests, And it tells me that my index view is not null. It's passing. Let's see. Okay, there. So it shows me index is not null. So I want to write a second test that's similar to the one we did in our dummies controller. This test passes, but it's not a very good test. It tells us that we got something back, but it doesn't tell us in any way what we got back and if we got back the things we are expecting. All it says is when we call the product index, we get something. So let's go look at our product index. So here's the method, right? Use the database to fetch the list of products and related categories, return a view, and also pass in the list of products. So I would suggest we want actually 2 unit tests for this line. What 2 things should we be testing on line 30? The first one is the thing we already did in the dummies controller. What tests would make sense here? So, okay, so that's one thing we could test, yep. And what type of data do we have, Diana? What data is displayed on this page if I go to this link? So my products index method, what should we see? Yeah, a list of products. So we'll want a unit test for this. And yes, we'll want to make sure that the list is also ordered alphabetically, A to Z. So we should test that. What else should we test about the view? So we want to test the data that gets returned. We'll do that after we take a break because it's a little more complicated. What should we be testing about the view that's returned? We already did it with our dummies controller. What did we test here? Yeah, we want to make sure that the view that loads is called index. So let's do this test for products. We'll take a break and then we'll deal with the data afterwards. So I'm going to go to my controller. I want to make the same change here that I did in my dummies controller. Let's name the view explicitly. So before we return a list of products, we're going to also, yes. So this is a case of taking the code, the scaffold, because we didn't write this code. The scaffolding generated all these return statements. We should be adding as the first parameter of each one of these the actual name of the view, because it's better code, it's more specific. So we're going to add the index that as a string. That's going to be the first parameter now of our return view statement. So the code that's highlighted in blue on my screen, that's new. Everything else on line 30 was the original code Visual Studio built. So now the unit test we need is going to check that the result is called index. So we'll write this test when we will take a break. So I'm going to create a new test method. Again, it's going to be void, and it's going to be index loads index view, which is the same name we used in the dummies controller test, but it describes what's happening. This is the method we're testing. This is the result we're expecting. We don't really need an arrange here, so we can just act. This is going to have to be a little bit different. I'll explain why in a minute. View result controller.index. But I've also got to use dot result, and I'll explain why. We've got to add the missing reference for view result. I'm going to reference Microsoft.asp.NET Core.MVC. So there's one thing that's different here. Here's in our products controller. Here was the act in the dummies controller. They're similar with one small difference. This one doesn't have the dot result at the end, but we need it in this case. Why? I will show you. In our dummies controller, our index method just returns an iAction result, a contract that represents the result of an action method. But when we scaffolded our products controller, notice the return type is different. It's an asynchronous task iAction result. So it's still returning a result, but this code runs asynchronously, which we won't get into the details too much of. We'll talk more about that next semester in advanced server-side scripting. So because of that return type, we need dot result. And then we can assert dot are equal. So we're expecting a string called index. And now we're going to check the result dot view name. I'm going to run all my tests again. And my test run is finished, and now we get a little green check mark. So we call index, we convert the iAction result to a view result, and we're checking that that view is called index. In my products controller now, it tells us we have, that's interesting. Why did that fail? We need to do the same here, actually. This should be dot result. So I'll save that. Run my tests again. Hopefully this one will pass now as well. Okay. I'll come back to that. We'll figure that one out. I suppose if we cast it as a view result, that should fix it. And I'll run it again. Okay, so now it's green. So we want to keep modifying our tests until they pass. Okay, it's 5-1. I'm going to push this code up to GitHub. We'll take a break. When we come back, we want to test the other thing. I made the act statement the same. I cast that it's a view result dot result. So I changed this part and added this as well. So I'm going to push to GitHub. When we come back, we're going to make the check that Diana and I think Maggie were suggesting. We need to actually check the data now, that we have a list of products, and also that those products are sorted alphabetically. So we're going to check that. We'll run a few tests on our details as well. So we will come back at 1:05. I don't know, Farouk, but it seems unlikely.